Yes, so Dr. Maurice Rawlins is currently a natural resource specialist at the World Bank based in South Korea. And Maurice was actually at the foundation quite a number of years ago. And he was actually one of the main reasons I joined the foundation because he was at that time, I think just before, a lab demonstrator in his early years at UB St. Augustine. And Maurice has gone on to really sort of pave the way, especially coming from Trinidad Tobago and this whole idea of ecosystem services and the use of ecosystem-based adaptation, particularly at a landscape level, to look at natural resources management. He went on from the foundation to do a master's degree at Oxford in environmental change. And then he came back to Trinidad to do his PhD in environmental biology through a real cutting edge project led by UN Environment called the Project for Ecosystem Services. After that, he went on to the World Bank for quite a number of years to the point that he is now, and he has had quite significant experience and also a really good journey. I would say it is very inspirational, especially for those who know him. And I'm hoping that he, like Salome and Alexander previously, can help shed some light on really what it takes to be someone who's trying to make a difference in protecting our planet as a career. So I'll pass this over now to Maurice, who will take us through the rest of the webinar.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much, Omar. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, excellent. All right, thanks so much, and good morning to everyone. Let me just project my screen.
I mean, before he goes on, it's not morning for Maurice. He's graciously agreed to do this when it's 40 minutes after 10 his time at night. So thanks again, Maurice, for this.
Sure, no problem. Yes, so to everyone, my name is Maurice Rawlins, and it is a pleasure to speak with you today. Let me say, first of all, thanks to the Cropper Foundation and Omar for giving me this opportunity to share with you in this webinar series as part of Earth Day. As Omar indicated already, I used to work at the Cropper Foundation years ago, and it's really good to see that the foundation is continuing to do this excellent work in the broad area of sustainable development. So let me say a little bit about myself in terms of the topics that we are discussing today. So I am a specialist in natural resource management issues. And so what this means is that I do work on forest, I do work on coastal and marine issues, on climate change, and on biodiversity. I specialized in forest ecology during my PhD, but I've done many things along the way that have enabled me to work on a variety of topics. And so as Omar indicated, I live in South Korea now, and I'm working for the World Bank, which is an international development institution. And I focus work in East Asia, but we can talk more about that later. I am, of course, a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, but very much consider myself to be a global citizen, which means that simply that there are things and issues that I care about that affect the countries around the world, and I choose to participate in finding common solutions for those issues. And so I've been asked to speak on the topic of landscape science and ecology. What are some of the key issues that make this topic important? And then wrap up by sharing a bit about the career opportunities that involve landscapes, ecology, etc. And so I'll structure my discussion in this order. But let's start by leveling off what we mean when we talk about landscapes, right? And so I'm not too sure the backgrounds of the audience today, and so I'll try not to use too many technical terms in it. But there is an official definition when we talk about landscape. It's a heterogeneous land area comprising interacting ecosystems that is repeated in similar form throughout, right? And so it's a really sort of high-level definition, but I think using an example and the image you see on the screen is an example of a landscape. And so here you see a classic landscape, mountains that have forest in them. And so that's the image in the top left corner. We have agricultural lands that are downstream of the forest. We have an urban area. And so all of these different elements are part of a continuous landscape, and all of these elements interact. For example, the water that's generated in the hillside forest provide water needed for agriculture. Agricultural lands provide food for the urban area. People in the urban area pay for food, and the money enables people to work on farms, and so you get that return, and so on. Another example is water generated in forest lands, which enables hydropower. So that's that image you see in the bottom sort of center. So it enables hydropower, which provides electricity for this fictitious town that we're talking about in our example, and so forth. We could also talk about the role that the forest plays in terms of habitats. And so the forests provide habitats for bees and other insects that do help with pollination of agricultural crops. And so you see there are relationships among the various land uses, and it's the management of these relationships that's what's important in the landscape. And so why important to manage? They're important to manage because policy changes, actions, interventions, anything we do in the landscape has effects in other parts of the landscape that could sometimes be disastrous. And so let's take another example using the same fictitious landscape, right? And so we have a situation where the number of people in the urban area has suddenly increased because migrants are coming in, birth rates are high, and so the population is growing. And so this has created more demand for agricultural products, which creates an incentive among farmers to grow more plants and to plant more. And so since all of the agricultural lands are already occupied, farmers decide to encroach on the forest and cut down forest in the hillsides. Now, remember we showed that, or we discussed earlier that the forest helped to provide water for agriculture, irrigation, and for hydropower. And so you cut down the forest, there is less forest and less ability to generate water. And so the hydropower dams cannot operate at 100% capacity and will therefore operate at an economic loss because there are foregone monetary benefits. So less hydropower means less energy for the town and higher prices because energy needs to be imported or there will be energy blackouts. And so this is a really simplified example of what often happens in landscapes when we take decisions or when things happen and they generate a chain reaction of other things. Now, because the landscapes are so massive, right? And so we're talking about the scale of the size of Trinidad, some landscapes that we deal with globally are, it's very difficult to see these interactions. And so part of landscape science is really being able to understand from what we call a bird's eye view, being able to see everything, the interactions of the different elements of the landscape, and then sort of using science, etc., and various policy processes to bring different actors who are responsible for different parts of the landscape together to have discussions and dialogue. So when we talk about landscape science, we're really talking about the study of the relationships among different parts of the landscape. And so we often need a lot of specializations to come together to help to figure out these relationships. For example, in understanding the relationship between the forest and the hillsides and the water that is used for agriculture or for hydropower, we would need, for example, a forest ecologist who understands plants and trees and how the collection of these as a forest ecosystem help to provide water. We will need a hydrologist who understands how water that falls as rain flows over land. Some of that will seep into the ground as groundwater. It will make its way as river to the river, how the flow in the river would change over time, over seasons, etc. We will need an irrigation specialist, we'll need a hydropower dam specialist, and so on. And so you see, when we talk about landscape management, there are many different specializations that we need that are not typically what we think of as being within the conservation field. And so this is sort of a key takeaway here, you know, that I know that there is interest, particularly among young people who are within the environment and biodiversity field and all this sort of thing, to want to get into a career in conservation. But just to let you know that there are many other things that could be done in which you can work towards the conservation objectives and outcomes. And so coming back to this idea of why we study landscapes, you know, we study landscapes in order to better manage the activities that we do in landscapes so that they can continue to be productive. You know, life is all about decision making. And so with landscape management, we also try to anticipate the impact of decisions before we make them, so that we can avoid the costs associated with bad decisions, which can include loss of life, loss of property, economic damage, etc. And so let me mention at this time some of the major issues we deal with for which landscape science and management play a major role. So deforestation and forest loss is a significant issue. Globally, it's a significant issue because deforestation is accelerating in many parts of the world and in many tropical forests. And so there are many things that happen when we lose forest. Of course, climate change and the release of carbon into the into the atmosphere is one of the things that that happen. But then we also lose a lot of economic benefits when we lose forests, right? We lose jobs, we lose livelihoods, we lose biodiversity that underpins tourism, we lose the watershed functions, etc. So there's a lot that that we lose as a result of deforestation. Flooding is another prevalent issue that we deal with within landscapes. So many things that we do in the upper parts of landscapes, in the upstream, do affect the downstream. And while flooding is a prevalent issue all over the world, and so these images here are from Port of Spain, measuring the impact of landscape relationships on forests is often quite challenging, right? On flooding is often quite challenging because flooding itself is a quite a complex issue, and it's not simply that you cut forest on a hillside and you flood downstream. Many different things happen and interact, and so we're getting better at studying such relationships, but there is quite a bit of work to be done. Certainly in Trinidad, a few years ago when I was doing my PhD, we were trying to crack that nut, you know, and I think we made good qualitative associations between what was happening in the Northern Range and what was happening in terms of flooding in Port of Spain and environs, but it still remains a challenging thing to quantify. Illegal wildlife harvesting, you know, so no doubt many of you would be reading these days about the relationship between COVID-19 and illegal wildlife harvesting, and this is also a landscape issue, you know. So what we're seeing in a lot of countries is that that often people don't harvest harvest wildlife for no reason, right? It's often for economic gain. And so you have these value chains that occur where there is a demand somewhere for wildlife, whether for consumption as food or for traditional medicines or whatever you may have, and it creates a value chain in many different countries, right? And so you may know of some iconic type wildlife issues with rhinoceros, elephants for ivory and all that sort of thing. But there are also other issues with smaller types of wildlife that are quite prevalent. And so when we bring wildlife together with human populations, you know, you can get transmission of some zoonosis and all that sort of thing. And so it is a landscape issue that we are seeing. And so we are tackling this issue of illegal wildlife harvesting through a landscape lens and focus. And if you're interested in understanding more about that, we can talk some more to that. Agricultural expansion, forest fires, and drought, they're all related landscape issues that we have to deal with. And so again, these are prevalent all across the world. This image here is from Vietnam. And so it's one of the places where I work, and drought is combining with poor land management, with climate change, etc., to cause these prolonged drying out issues, the death of crops, that sort of thing. But again, it's a landscape issue, because the flows of water to various areas, again, and you don't see it so much in Trinidad, because it's a smaller country. But when you look at some other places that are in different continents and share transboundary water resources, that sort of thing. So places in Africa, in South America, in Asia, etc. Many of the decisions that we make in these very large landscapes affect the flows of water and affect susceptibility to droughts and all of these sorts of things. So how do we deal with these issues, right? And so landscape science and management is really advancing through innovation and digital technologies. And so there are some key areas in terms of the things that we do typically in landscape science and management, where we're seeing a lot of progress on innovation. And so in scientific modeling, we do quite a lot of forest modeling, hydrological modeling, economic modeling, people and behavioral change, climate modeling. And sorry, we're using big data, satellites, artificial intelligence, machine learning to help us figure out relationships within the landscape. Forests are so complex, and the ecology of the forest is so complex that it takes a large amount of data and modeling to help us figure out ecological processes. And so now with machines, that can think and can process data faster than humans, we're able to do a lot more. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are major emerging areas of work, and in fact, the world is experiencing a shortage of skills in this area, in coding and computer literacy, etc. And so it's something to think about. Satellites and remote sensing is now much cheaper than it used to be. Every year it gets cheaper. And so increasingly we're using it a lot more. Computers have a lot more processing power, so we're able to do a lot more data manipulation. We use drones to help us to map the landscape, collect data, images, etc. We also use our phones, right? And so our phones are now these mini computers that have tremendous processing power. And so we use them to collect data in real time over large geographic areas. In terms of scenario development, where we ask a lot of policy questions. If we did this, if we did that, what is the result? This is an important tool where there are multiple and competing interests in the landscape. It allows for negotiation, allows for compromise, etc. Those of you who would have joined the talk by Alex would have talked about and discussed economic valuation. And so this is something that we do quite a lot in landscape management. We value the benefits we receive from natural systems like forests, swamps, etc. In order to help us better negotiate, compare apples with apples and apples with oranges, in terms of what happens when we lose the benefits of some of these ecosystems. And so with this, we can do trade-off analysis, etc. And then, so in terms of policy development, we're developing a lot of these interactive web-based decision support tools that can bring together spatial data in a manner that is really useful for decision makers. And so this is just an example of one of the things that I'm working on in Cambodia. And it's this platform for data management within the Mekong Delta. And it's something that we're using for making decisions on the types of investments that governments would make within the Delta. And so when we talk about careers in conservation or related to conservation, there are several paths that can be taken that can lead to economic viable economically viable opportunities. And so let me share a little bit of my own journey in terms of what happened with me. So coming out of A levels, you know, I was fairly sure that I wanted to do some work within the environmental space. I had also been very much interested in work on poverty reduction. And so I wasn't quite sure how the two things would come together, but I thought, you know what, I'll figure it out along the way. And so I did a first degree in environmental management, and then right after that, I went on to work at the Cropper Foundation. And when I started out at Cropper, I thought, all right, you know what, I'm going to get into the space of doing policy and all this sort of thing. You know, I really inflated myself. But I didn't do any of that. You know, I worked on environmental education, and that was really quite useful for me. And then I graduated onto working on project management for a sustainable hillside farming project. I went away, I did my master's, and when I came back, I started working on some different work that was doing, working on a national biodiversity assessment in Trinidad, working on Northern Range ecosystem services through a global project that we had. And so things happened and they evolved along the way, you know. So then I started my PhD, and then I moved to the World Bank and started there. And so the journey was certainly something that I could not have predicted, right? And so when I left UE in 2004, I never would have thought, you know, that here I would be working in East Asia, for example, you know. And so the message here is that you don't need to have it all figured out, but I think you need to have some of the basics, right? And so within the space of conservation and landscape and all this sort of thing, of course, having a specialization is important, but also knowing about other topics is equally quite important. And so this is the second point about developing a T profile. And so the T profile is simply that you have technical depth in something, and so that's the vertical part of the T. And then the horizontal part of the T is having a broad knowledge of many things. Because when we work in landscapes, you know, you have to understand the different sectors within which you're working. You have to understand the different issues, the different sectoral issues and technical issues. And so you have to be conscious and you have to be aware. The world, I think, has no place anymore for people who are very strict biologists or very strict chemists or whatever. You know, you have to be diverse in that way. And so having additional skills in things like modeling, GIS and coding, artificial intelligence, machine learning, these are things that are really high currency. And so it's not to say that you need to have a degree in these things, you know, but there are many short courses that are offered. And so Microsoft, for example, offers an entire free course in artificial intelligence. Google offers a lot of free courses as well. And so having these kinds of skills make you a lot more marketable in the space of ecology, landscape management, whatever you may have. There are a lot of new jobs that are emerging as well in fields that you didn't quite find people who have backgrounds in biodiversity and conservation and all that sort of thing engaging in. And so a lot of companies are now working on sustainability management, and sustainability reporting is really becoming quite a norm. It's a standard, right? And so we used to talk about corporate social responsibility before, but now it's sustainability reporting and management. And so there's a lot of work that goes into that. In impact investors, people are increasingly investing their money into natural resources in terms of natural resource plantations, that sort of thing. And so impact investment management is a thing, is a space that could be, that you can get into. Having a background in conservation and having a background in business is a nice combination for this sort of thing. Increasingly, green bonds are being developed. Green banking is a thing that's really coming up and emerging. And so within this new space, you know, I think that there is opportunity for really crafting careers in a way that enables you to meet your your goals of contributing to a conservation objective, but then also to develop a bankable and viable career. And of course, in terms of plastics, you know, plastics is getting increasing attention around the world, both sort of in the terrestrial space, but then also in terms of the marine space and marine plastics. And so there is a lot of work now that needs to be done with respect to the space. And so pollution and plastics is a big part of conservation as well. I mean, plastics are increasingly finding their way into food chains. And so this is an area that that could be considered as well. And so with that, I just wanted to share with you a few thoughts on landscape science, management, provide a little bit of advice on careers. And so what I'm hoping in the rest of the time that we have, that we could, you could raise some questions. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions that you may have with respect to careers, if you're just starting out or maybe mid-career or something like that. Or if you want to learn more about my journey, that's fine. My contact information is here. And so let me now turn it back over to Omar, and we can start the question session.
Great, thank you so much, Maurice. All right, so folks, like I mentioned before, we can use the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you to ask your questions to Maurice. So feel free to do so now. Okay, Zico, you can go ahead.
Hi, I'm just wondering, how might COVID-19 having an impact where everybody is quarantined have an impact on the landscape, where, you know, you don't have people hiking, a lot of the projects that probably would have been disrupting the natural environment have been halted. Yeah, I'm just wondering what that might have on the landscape and the ecosystems in those spaces.
Okay, thanks. So do you want me to respond immediately or take a few?
No,
and then
you can respond immediately.
Yeah, okay, all right, thanks. All right, thanks so much, Zico. Excellent question. So I will answer from two perspectives, sort of a Trinidad perspective and a national one. So, so I think we can see a range of impacts, right, in terms of ecosystems. We see a positive impact, and I mean globally. You must have been, if you've been paying attention, seeing reports of reduction in pollution, reduction on sort of fishing effort, for example, and so reduce the marine activity. So what this means is that yes, that ecosystems will to some extent rebound, right? Because they are just experiencing a lot less disturbance, right? I think that there were some really good stories about turtles coming back, for example, in Thailand, and I imagine for Trinidad and Tobago it will be the same, where beaches are now empty, and so habitats are undisturbed. And so that's a good thing for ecosystems, right? And so I think we'll see a positive impact in some places, but then in other places we'll see a negative impact because with the COVID and with social distancing and with people being unable to, and this is more out of Trinidad and some other countries, with people being unable to work and sort of earn incomes, a lot of people will actually turn to the forest for their livelihoods, right? And so what you would start to see, and what we're seeing already in some places, is that we're seeing that illegal wildlife hunting is on the rise. We'll begin to see a lot more illegal logging for timber extraction, and then depending on how long the COVID progresses and social distancing progresses, we'll begin to see a lot more possibly deforestation as people need to grow food, right? And so those are some of the negative impacts. And so it's really, it is a balance depending on how the ecosystems were used before. That's the sort of the long and short answer.
Great. Okay, so we have one question from Ariane Marie, and she wants to know, well, she asked, what do you think the link is between agriculture and climate change, and what can be done to reduce the impact of agriculture on the environment?
Okay. Okay, so the link between agriculture and climate change is a little bit of a complex one, right? But let's just take agriculture by itself. For example, if there were crops on the ground and what that does for climate change. So with agriculture and climate change, one of the things that we often focus on is the energy use that it takes for agriculture. And so many agricultural systems are mechanized, and so you have high uses of tractors and all that sort of thing. And so there are high energy demands that come from agriculture. And so many of these tractors, of course, are still using, in many places, fossil fuels. And so we're getting that link between high use of fossil fuel energy, release of carbon, etc. In fertilizer production and in fertilizer use, there is also the release of greenhouse gases. And so that's another space where we have emissions. Anytime we disturb the soil, we disturb soil carbon, right? And so things like tilling and so turning up the soil in order to plant it also has an impact on climate change and release of carbon. So that's looking at it from that perspective. Often what we see with agriculture as from a landscape perspective is that forest areas are often cleared to put agriculture. And so of course, when you clear forested areas, you lose carbon from the trees themselves, but then you also lose carbon from the soil. Now, crops to some extent do absorb some carbon dioxide, and so they are what we call a sink for emissions, but they are not as big a sink as forests, right? And so overall, there is a greater release of carbon to the atmosphere. And so what we find is that agriculture in many places does drive greenhouse gas emissions and contributes negatively to climate change. That being said, there has been a lot of work, I think, over the last decade or so to really minimize the impact of agriculture on climate change. And so leading to your question on reducing impacts on the environment, there has been a lot of work on agricultural intensification. And so this is planting more crops on the same area of land so that we reduce its use of deforestation. We've also done quite a lot of work on changing crops, right? And changing crops to be more efficient with respect to water use, but then also to be more efficient in terms of their overall productivity. So that's a big thing. Within the AI space, and I urge you to check this out, a lot of companies like Microsoft, etc., are doing a lot of work to improve what we call precision agriculture. And so with precision agriculture, we're using a lot of sensors and drones and all that sort of thing to really understand what are the needs for water, what are the needs for fertilizer, etc., for crops, so that we reduce the water use by crops, we reduce the fertilizer use, etc. And so this is how we're using innovation to reduce the impact on the environment. One more thing on this, so there are techniques, many techniques in agriculture that have been studied for a long time, for the last 50 years, on reducing agricultural impact through changing the way that agriculture is done. So engaging in agroforestry is one of the obvious ones, but there is a whole movement around sustainable farming that promotes environmental benefits as part of agriculture.
Great. All right. So I'm just going to, we have one question about career opportunities from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, if you want to ask this live, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I can read it for you. Okay, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hi, right, so my question is that when you returned from doing your MSc, how did you get into more career opportunities in the field of natural resource management? Because I'm currently doing more compliance work. I'm thinking of switching careers more in that direction. So how did you get opportunities to do more project work for natural resource management?
Okay, thanks. I don't know if I have a clear answer for you, Elizabeth, but I think a good question nonetheless. So why I came back, so I was in the UK, and I was thinking, you know, I would stay in the UK and do some work, etc. But then, Professor John Agard, whom I'm sure you must know, he called me up one day and he said, listen, you know, we have this project that we're doing. It's a global project. Called the Project for Ecosystem Services, and so there is some work that you can do on this. The Cropper Foundation is involved, UE is involved, and so if this is something that you want to work on, think about doing a PhD on as well. This is something that you can do. And so fortunately for me, you know, when I returned, I went right back into the Cropper Foundation, and so I was working part-time Cropper, a little bit for UE as well. And so that's how I managed to do it. So that being said, I think within Trinidad, there are not a huge amount of opportunities to do work just on conservation, right? I think that is something that I wouldn't want to create a false impression about. I think that there are a few agencies that that do work on natural resources that you can get in contact with. The one that's off the top of my head, besides Cropper, of course, is Canary. So they do a lot of work, but there are others as well that are engaged in that space. And so I would say my advice to you would be to check out those agencies and see what they're doing. A lot of people and sort of what has been a pathway in Cropper is that a lot of people start off doing a little bit of part-time volunteering type thing, and then eventually move into a more full-time position. Again, you know, because the job market for conservation in Trinidad is not huge, it's competitive. And so you have to bring something that's valuable, right? And so it goes back again to not only bringing a degree in biology or whatever, but you have to bring something else, you know, some other technical skill that would allow you to rise above the others.
I think if I could also just give you a quick some quick notes, Elizabeth. When I started in Cropper Foundation, I actually started to help redesign the foundation's website, because at that time they had no need for someone with technical skills, but they needed someone who knew a little bit about coding. And coincidentally, I just happened to teach myself website design over one July, August holidays, and that's how I started. So, and I wormed my way in that way. But just also following up on what Salome had said yesterday is incredibly important, especially in a place where you have limited opportunities, to pay close attention to this whole idea of networking. You know, to be part of webinars like this, to go to events, public lectures, because, you know, that's how, you know, that's how you meet people who might have interesting things going on. And you never know, that's when they might say, oh, we're thinking about doing XYZ, you know, would you be interested? So I think it's always trying to kind of keep your eyes open. And a lot of times it's literally by just going to things, you know, asking about, you know, how you can get an invitation to go to this, and going up to people and just saying hi afterwards and telling them that you're interested. So, yeah, so I think that's also something to also pay close attention to, because you can't just rely on sending an email with a resume or a CV. because that's just not enough these days. The personal connection makes a big big impact. Okay, so I will pass us on now to Skylar. So Skylar, I'm going to unmute you as well, and you can go ahead and ask your question to Maurice. Or I can ask it for you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Hi, good morning or good night. I just wanted to ask the question if the rise in sea level due to climate change has drastically caused issues in landscapes.
So, sorry, what's the question?
If the rise in sea levels due to climate change has caused issues in landscapes.
Yes, and so there are two responses to that, right? And so one is that that there has been loss of coastal land, right? And so it's significant in many countries around the world, in island countries and continents, etc. So that's one issue in terms of the loss of coastal land. And so what is happening is that with the loss, you have now the sea interacting with ecosystems that are not typically coastal. And so a lot of those ecosystems will die out, because they are not used to saline conditions. So that's changing the landscape and changing the vegetation, changing the biodiversity and all that sort of thing, and ultimately changing the land use. And so that's one element. The other element comes through salinization and saltwater intrusion. And so, of course, when the sea rises up, it has more opportunity to get into underground aquifers and all that sort of thing. And so you're getting, particularly within those aquifers that are fairly close to the coast, you're getting salinization of those. And so brackish conditions are happening, but then you're also getting the movement of saline conditions up rivers. And so, of course, this is changing quite a lot the biodiversity of such rivers, but then it's also changing the way how those rivers could be used, right? And so, for example, in Vietnam, in the Mekong Delta, so there's been, that's at bottom part of Vietnam, the south of it. And so with sea level rise there's been a lot of salinization and a lot of salt water moving up the Mekong River. And so where farmers before would have grown rice with fresh water from the Mekong River, now that this river has become brackish, they're no longer able to grow rice. And so you have this entire industry that's built around a rice crop that is no longer able to do this, right? And so what they've had to do now is to adapt their livelihoods and ultimately adapt the landscape to be more conducive to deal with the saltwater conditions. So yes, it does impact quite significantly on landscapes.
Okay, and we have one question from Melissa about strategies countries have implemented for agricultural production and growth where there's limited land space. I think you pointed out a couple earlier: precision agriculture, intensive agriculture. Any thoughts on maybe one or two more examples for limited land space?
Sure, yeah. Good question. So hydroponics is big, right? And so they're able to grow a lot more food within small spaces. And so now with hydroponics, you can really stack plants. So that's one thing. Vertical gardens is really big as well. And so Singapore has some really excellent examples of that. They're a country that is super tiny, but they've got massive production, right? And so vertical gardens, rooftop gardens are another thing. And so what you're seeing now is that agriculture is not only a thing for rural areas, but they're bringing it into the urban space as well. And so this is how it's taking advantage of the food. On the issue of limited land space, which is a little bit indirect, but food wastage is really quite a significant issue. And so one of the things that we need to do better is reduce food loss, right? And so by reducing food loss, then it trickles back down the agricultural supply chain, and you really don't need to grow as much on the same plot of land. But that is a big discussion because there are a lot of interest in these agricultural supply chains that are not in the best, without the best interest for the environment is what I would say. But yeah, those are some additional things I could think of.
Great. I mean, I think it's of interest to all of us that I think it's 1/3 of all calories from food grown in the world are wasted. That's 1/3, and I think they've estimated that 200 million hectares, or I think the size of Mexico. That's the amount of land that's used for crops and food that's wasted by food wastage. So I think that's, it's a lot to consider. Okay, so I'm gonna give the last question of the day to Ariane Marie. So if she would like, I'm going to unmute her now to ask her this final question of the session.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. I was just wondering if you had any tips or about universities or degrees so that we can get involved in climate change and conservation. Because I know you mentioned earlier that there are a wide range of degrees that you can get into, but I want to know if you had any particular ones that you would recommend.
So you're talking about like a bachelor's degree or master's or what?
Yeah, a bachelor's degree.
Bachelor's degree. Again, I think that there is just so much out there. You're talking about just within Trinidad or internationally as well?
Internationally.
Internationally. Yeah, again, there are a lot of options that are coming out. And so even from the time I left to now, there are a lot of university courses that are now blended, right? And so you get climate change and business, right? You get climate change and law, climate change and politics. And so there are any number of things that you can do, and so I'm afraid I don't quite have a straight answer with respect to what I would suggest. But let me just say, whatever you do, if you intend to continue within this career field, I think having a degree that gives you a firm background, particularly at the bachelor's level, if you're thinking about something like climate change, having a degree that exposes you to different aspects of climate change, so climate change finance, climate change policy, climate change science, all of that is really quite useful, because when you move on from there, these are the things that employers are going to be asking for. What's your breadth within this area, and so in addition to that, I would say it's also good to think about climate change and something else, right? So just a little bit of tip. Climate change, issues like sustainable development and all this sort of thing, biodiversity, they have their peaks, right? In terms of global discourse. And so climate change has been at a peak, I think, for a few years. Before that, we talked a lot about sustainable development. After climate change, I imagine we're going to be talking a lot about circular economy. And so you have to keep up with the trend, right? And so having a pure degree in climate change in 5 years, I think you're really shooting yourself in the leg, because you would not be seen as marketable. And so I think you really got to think about, okay, so climate change and what else, with another discipline that is a little bit more, transferable. I would say is a good thing to think about. On universities, on university degrees, I mean, if you're thinking about getting into an international career, a little bit of advice, your bachelor's degree is not, and in terms of where you go for your bachelor's degree is not super important. Where you go for your master's is a bit more important. People pay attention to that. And so it's something that you should keep in mind to try to get into a good school for master's degree. And then PhD, similar type thing. People do look at the school that you've gone to, but I think it's more the metrics are different because people look at publications and all that kind of thing. So they assess you differently. So that's what I would offer on that question.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so Maurice, any final thoughts, words of wisdom for our attendees before we wrap up for today?
No, I mean, I actually had a question. I just wanted to get a sense of if there were anyone who were interested in an international career in environment or anything like that. There's a lot that we could speak about within that as well. And so if it's something that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can connect you with different people or provide advice myself or whatever is needed.
Yes, and like I said yesterday, we'll be sending around emails with the presenters' contacts, as well as PDFs and also links to books, video presentations that they might have mentioned as well after this first series is done. And because of the interest that we've had, we are going to attempt to keep this going for a bit, bringing people on board from, again, from Cropper's own network that have gone on to do quite diverse things. So once again, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Maurice, for staying up late to talk to us today. And I'm sure everyone got quite a lot out of this. So thank you again. And everyone, thanks for joining us. And we will be in touch for sure about the postponed environmental law and activism webinar, which we hope to have next week, the first half of next week. So thank you all again and have a great day.
Bye.